For 46 years, a specific set of numbers defined the heights of television success. 35 million viewers every Tuesday night. Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall weren't just stars. They were the faces of a working-class American dream. But behind the laughter of Laverne and Shirley, a quiet, structural war was being waged over two outsiders named Lenny and Squiggy. While the world saw a perfect ensemble, the reality was a fractured set where the lead actresses finally broke their silence on who really held the power. In 1977, the American living room belonged to two women in a Milwaukee brewery. The numbers were staggering. To put it in perspective, nearly 1 out of every 3 people in the country tuned in at the exact same time. It was a cultural monopoly. But inside the walls of Paramount Stage 19, that success felt less like a throne and more like a cage. Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams were the engines of this machine, yet they felt the steering wheel slipping from their hands. The friction didn't start with a script. It started with an intrusion. Gary Marshall, the show's creator, made a decision that would change the chemistry of television history. He brought in Michael McKean and David Lander. They were the greasers, Lenny and Squiggy. They weren't part of the original vision. They were a package deal from a college comedy troupe called The Credibility Gap, and Gary had essentially forced them into the pilot to add a bit of grit to the sugary sitcom formula. To Cindy and Penny, these weren't just side characters. They were a threat to the rhythm they had spent months perfecting. Every time the door swung open and that iconic, nasal hello echoed through the set, the focus shifted. The stars were being eclipsed in their own home. It created a strange, silent tension. The girls were the top billed talent, but these two men were stealing the biggest laughs with half the effort. It was a battle for the very soul of the show's timing. If you were in their shoes, would you protect your spotlight, or let the outsiders take the laughs to make the show better? It's a harder choice than it sounds when your career is on the line. Tell me your move in the comments. The answer wasn't as simple as it seemed, because while the actresses were worried about the spotlight, something much more technical was happening in the shadows of the writer's room. A divide was forming, and it wasn't just about who got the punchlines. It was about who actually owned the characters. While the world saw a unified cast, a quiet rebellion was brewing during the 2 a.m. rehearsals. The girls were about to realize that being the stars didn't mean they had the power, and that realization was about to lead to a decade of hidden scripts and secret rewrites. The audience saw Lenny and Squiggy as the lovable comic relief, but behind the curtain, Penny and Cindy saw them as a structural problem. The writing for the boys often felt like it belonged to an entirely different show. It was surreal, almost cartoonish, and it clashed violently with the grounded, working-class struggle the two leads were trying to portray. It reached a point where the actresses didn't recognize the world they were living in once the cameras started rolling. To save a show, they did something bold. They became contractual ghostwriters. This wasn't just about changing a word here or there. Penny and Cindy began shadow directing their own episodes to manage the growing chaos. They weren't just acting anymore. They were fighting a daily war against a writer's room that seemed determined to turn Laverne and Shirley into a live-action comic book. The actresses insisted on logic. They demanded that the humor come from the characters' hearts, not just from slapstick gags involving the greasers next door. The numbers reveal the true cost of this creative battle. The average sitcom script is roughly 45 pages long. By the time Cindy and Penny were finished with them, those pages were covered in red ink, frantic notes, and total structural overhauls. These rewrites didn't happen during lunch breaks. They happened at 2 a.m. in dimly lit trailers after 14 hours of filming. They were exhausted. They were frustrated. And yet they felt they had no choice. If they didn't fix the scripts, the show would lose its soul. They were essentially doing the work of 3 people, starring, writing, and directing, while the studio executives watched from the sidelines, counting the profits. But as the rewrites piled up, so did the resentment. The smiles the audience saw on Tuesday nights were becoming harder and harder to maintain during the week. This wasn't just a sitcom anymore. It was an endurance test. And while they managed to keep the quality high for years, the human cost was about to become public in a way that no rewrite could fix. The pressure was building to a breaking point, and the trigger wasn't a bad script. It was a life-changing event the studio refused to acknowledge. By the early 80s, the high-octane engine of Stage 19 was finally running out of oil. The public saw a legendary duo at the peak of their powers, but in 1982, the silence didn't just crack, it shattered. Most people remember this as the year Cindy Williams suddenly vanished from the show. The tabloids were quick to feed the fire, painting a picture of a diva whose ego had grown too large for the small screen. But the mystery wasn't about a clash of personalities. It was about a clash of humanity. The shift began with a single, life-changing fact. Cindy was pregnant. In the world of 1980s corporate television, this wasn't seen as a milestone to be celebrated. It was treated as a logistical failure. Cindy wasn't asking for the world. She made simple, human requests. She asked for her working hours to be adjusted so she wouldn't be on her feet for 14 hours straight. She asked for the basic dignity of a schedule that didn't risk her health. The studio's response was chillingly calculated. They didn't just say no, they leaned in. They scheduled Cindy to work on her actual due date. It was a cold, legal maneuver designed to force her into a corner. They wanted to prove that no matter how many millions of people love Laverne or Shirley, the individuals were just assets on a balance sheet. The ego the media reported on was actually a woman fighting a $20 million lawsuit just for the right to be a mother. Deep dive history like this is often buried under layers of PR fluff, designed to protect the magic of television. But if you value the cold, hard facts behind these legends and want to see the truth without the Hollywood gloss, join our circle by subscribing now. We'll look past the highlights to find the real story. As the legal battle raged, something unexpected happened within the cast. During this peak of absolute tension, the friction with Lenny and Squiggy evaporated. The outsiders weren't the enemy anymore. In the face of a cold, corporate machine, Penny, Cindy, Michael, and David found a common bond. They realized they were all being ground down by the same gears. The boys didn't side with the money. They stood by the women. They saw the exhaustion, the 2 a.m. rewrites, and the blatant disrespect Cindy was facing. This was the moment the silence truly broke. It wasn't a fight between actors over lines or laughs. It was a realization that they were an ensemble being treated like property. Cindy eventually walked away, leaving Penny to finish the show alone, but the bond they shared with Michael and David only deepened in the aftermath. They had survived the war, but they were about to face a much more personal kind of silence. Time has a strange way of softening the sharpest edges. Years after the sets were struck and the lights on Stage 19 were dimmed for good, the silence finally evolved into something else, a confession. In rare, reflective interviews and deeply personal memoirs, both Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall began to deconstruct the Lenny and Squiggy problem with brutal honesty. They didn't offer a shallow, Hollywood apology. Instead, they admitted something much deeper. They acknowledged that Michael McKean and David Lander weren't just the comic relief. They were the very heart of the show's surrealism. They admitted that even when the boys made their jobs twice as hard, they were the ones who elevated the show from a standard sitcom to a piece of American folk art. The frustration they felt in 1977 wasn't because the men were untalented. It was because they were too good. Their chaotic energy forced Cindy and Penny to work harder, to sharpen their timing, and to fight for every inch of the screen. It was an architecture built on a foundation of professional jealousy that eventually grew into a massive pillar of respect. This struggle isn't unique to a 1970s soundstage. It's a reflection of the high-pressure environments we all inhabit. It's that feeling of being forced to compete with the very people you actually love and admire. You want to be the best, but you realize that the person standing next to you, the one who drives you absolutely crazy with their quirks, is the reason the project is succeeding. We've all had that coworker who drove us crazy, but made the work better. Think of that person right now, the Squiggy in your life. That person who tested your patience, but sharpened your skills. The history of Laverne and Shirley reminds us that conflict isn't always the end of a relationship. Sometimes, it's the only way to build something that lasts 40 years. The women realized that the greasers were never the intruders they had feared. They were the missing pieces. By the time they reached this understanding, however, the world had moved on, and the cast was facing a reality far grimmer than a ratings drop. The final act of their story wouldn't be played for laughs, and it wouldn't happen in front of a live studio audience. It would happen in the quiet moments of a lifelong friendship, as they prepared for one final entrance that no one saw coming. The final years of Laverne and Shirley weren't written by a comedy room, but by the relentless passage of time. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the noise of the studio audience was replaced by a different kind of quiet. In 1999, David Lander, the man who had played Squiggy with such manic, greasy energy, revealed a secret he had been carrying for 15 years. He had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. In that moment, the old rumors of set feuds and professional bitterness didn't just fade. They were exposed as the myths they always were. The silence that had once defined the friction on set was replaced by a fierce, protective wall of support. Penny and Cindy didn't just reach out, they stood as his guardians. The women who once worried about the boys stealing their rhythm were now the ones ensuring David never felt he had to hide his struggle from the world. It was an alliance that lasted until the very end. The greasers and the girls had transitioned from a fractured ensemble into a family forged in the fires of 35 million viewers. But as we look back at the legacy of those 4 people in that Milwaukee brewery, a lingering mystery remains. Television changed forever in the mid-'80s, shifting toward glossier, more cynical humor. One has to wonder, if the studio had supported them, if the 4 of them had stayed together as a unified creative force, could they have saved the sitcom genre from its eventual decline? Could their grounded, working-class heart have survived the neon decade? We will never know the answer, but we do know that the drama on Stage 19 was just the beginning.